Okay, welcome everyone. This is another Clear Mountain interview, and today we are very happy, very pleased, blessed to invite Ajahn Gavesako to come and sit in, offer his perspective on Dhamma and learn more about his practice and time as a bhikkhu. So I'll just thank you very much, Ajahn, for agreeing to be interviewed. So I'll just read your biography and then we'll jump in. So Ajahn Gavesako was born in 1975 in the Czech Republic. He became interested in Asian religions and meditation around the age of 15. At the age of 18, he visited Amaravati Buddhist Monastery in England for the first time. As time passed, he began to spend his summer holidays there every year and to become more and more familiar with the Thai forest tradition in the lineage of Ajahn Sumedho. While studying philosophy in Prague, he translated a number of Buddhist texts from Pali and English into Czech. In 1998, he became an anagarika at Amaravati Monastery. Then in 2000, a samaner at Chethurst Monastery, and in 2001, he was ordained as a bhikkhu with Ajahn Sumedho as his preceptor. Ajahn Gavesako spent several years in monasteries in the Ajahn Chah tradition in England, such as Chethurst and Amaravati, and also in Thailand. After that, he lived in Western monasteries in Switzerland, Italy, Germany, New Zealand, and Norway. Ajahn Gavesako is currently living at Sumedharama Monastery in Portugal. So that's just the overview, but Ajahn, yes, thank you very much again. Perhaps we could begin just with your upbringing in the Czech Republic, and just curious if you would be willing to share some of your early influences, what kind of brought you to Buddhism and gave you this leaning.
Yes, so it's a particular personal background that always will have an influence on oneself. So in my case, you have to imagine at that time when I was born, it was still during the communist regime, and the country was pretty much sealed off from from much of the world, the Western world certainly. So there was really limited opportunity to have any sort of contact with Asia or Asian religions, directly. So the only thing that was available for me was finding some books. So I remember finding some very old books in the local library, published way before the Second World War. And I remember later getting into specifically, Buddhist texts. I found a copy of probably the first German translation of the Majjhima Nikaya by Karl Eugen Neumann in our local library in German. I could read German, and that was published in the 1895, I think. So that was the kind of access I had to literature. Even any kind of books basically were not allowed to be published during the communist time. They generally disapproved of religion anyway. So I became increasingly kind of attracted to the Asian, anything to do with Asia, China, Japan, and going through various different philosophies, and then finally really becoming more and more interested in what I could see was like the more original teachings of the Buddha that came from India, of course, and the original texts that were in the Pali language. So that finally I gained some access to some of those texts and in translation, and then it led me naturally to that kind of interest in even learning the original languages to have more direct understanding of it.
Thank you, Ajahn. I'm curious if you had any actual teachers, or was it mostly or entirely from books?
Yes, I had very little in terms of direct teachers. At that time, 1989, 1990, around that time, the sort of regime changed, and there was some people coming to visit from then on. So occasionally one could meet people from abroad, but it was still fairly limited. And then the internet was just sort of starting in those days. It was a bit delayed compared to, say, your part of the world. So when the internet later, like when I went to university, that's where really I gained access to the internet. And that was also the beginnings of, when all the Buddhist texts were being put on the internet. And that really helped me a lot to gain access to just the whole world of Buddhism as it exists. And in those days, I think a lot of people made use of these like internet discussion groups discussing, Buddhism. So it was a really great discovery. I can remember feeling like that really kind of opened up my world, and I gained access to that. But there was one address I had that I wrote to, and that was Bhikkhu Bodhi in Sri Lanka. So I remember I sent him a letter. It must have been about 16, 17, and started basically a correspondence with him. He was very kind and actually exchanging some letters with me and giving advice and sending these wheel publications, small booklets, and then later some larger books. And he seemed very keen to help someone from this part of the world which had very little access to Buddhist teachings, to Buddhist texts. And I was able to, obtain some of those texts. And I remember really treasuring these, publications, which these days, when you find them in a library, they are kind of sort of old print, in Sri Lanka, from Sri Lanka, not very good quality paper, and kind of people don't read them anymore. But I remember I really sort of treasured these Dhamma texts, and that's where I learned much of my Dhamma from, and the beginnings of also Pali terminology and all that. So that was my early approach to Buddhist teachings.
And so that's a pretty early age at 17. You mentioned, when you went into university, you began studying philosophy. And I'm just curious if you could talk about the difference of approach from the philosophy that you were learning versus, say, Buddhist philosophy or Buddhist practice. Is there overlap, or do they not overlap? What are the limitations? What are the advantages of having studied philosophy? And maybe which particular philosophers you were studying at that time?
So I was quite lucky in having some good teachers at Prague University who were mostly, there was classical philosophy, of course, the old Greeks and so on, medieval philosophy. But then I was able to focus more specifically on the kind of modern Western phenomenology. And there were some good teachers who specialized in that and were able to really explain it well. So I focused on that particular school, which deals with the way, say, our experience of the world and of ourselves is constituted, and how we can know things kind of directly in our experience. So that seemed to be quite a valid approach, and have some similarities with the, say, the way the Buddha talked about human experience in the suttas. So I found some of that helpful in those days. Was a good approach. But eventually, gradually, the longer I stayed in that academic environment and studying philosophy, I found more and more it was it was academic. It was something that one did as a kind of intellectual exercise. One had to write essays, and it was a lot to do with words, with writing and discussing, maybe refining one's understanding of particular terms, but essentially, something rather abstract. It was, at least the phenomenology, it pointed to like direct experience, but at least the way it was approached at the university, it was all really based on like Western philosophy. The way all the terminology came from, say, classical Western philosophy, Greek and Latin terms, and it seemed to be really kind of removed, say, from my interest, which was more and more like the Indian thought world, the Indian religions. And I think that's a kind of bias that still maybe persists until today between like studying, say, Indology or anything to do with ancient India. That's put in a different department, whereas philosophy is something that you study only using Western terms and Western terminology. And there's only few, say, scholars, Western scholars, that bridge those two. So that more and more I felt like I didn't really need to learn that much about ancient Greek terms or study Latin and formal logic and things like that. And so I turned more and more towards just focusing on the Buddhist texts and actually starting to learn Pali. And also, just to say that philosophy, Western philosophy, has that kind of limitation. I found even these phenomenological thinkers, they didn't really seem to apply, whatever the result was of their thinking. It wasn't a kind of a lived teaching. It was still fairly academic. So I was looking for something that could actually be lived, and applied in one's life.
Ajahn, I'm curious, you talk about the drawbacks of, so many, it seems like so many words, basically. But I'm curious what you think about this idea of writing as a form of thinking. Like, presumably, going through that education and trying to express yourself on paper, if you see benefit in that. It's a very different mode of learning than we get in the Thai forest tradition. That, the Thai forest tradition is almost, anti-academic in certain ways. Do you think there's value in that, in trying to express oneself on paper so as to test how well do I really know these things?
Yes, that was one thing that I gained, I think, from being in that academic environment, was to learn how to, say, refine one's understanding of a particular topic and then put it down in words and have it maybe commented on and challenged. So that was a good aspect of that, and just learning how to work with texts, with books, being able to analyze a subject and discuss it on a certain level with one's peers. So all that is, I think, very, very helpful, and that could actually be applied also to our kind of to the area of Buddhism, studying Buddhism. So that was actually good. That was definitely a benefit, and that helped me later on. Just being able to express some thoughts, and also just that analytical approach. Like when you read something, you read, say, different sources, and people approach a topic from various points of view, being able to examine it and compare these different points of view, and being able to extract the essential points that they are making. So all of that's a really good training to have, actually, in the kind of Western philosophical tradition.
Yeah, thank you, Ajahn. And this is kind of a nice bridge over into Pali. You mentioned studying Pali, and to start with, that can be just a very natural transition. You're learning another language, which is, it's a cognitive, stretch. You have to move yourself in a certain direction. And I'm curious if you could speak a bit more about both learning Pali, how that influenced your practice in your life, and actually translating Dhamma. You mentioned, or in your biography, we mentioned that you'd actually done translating from both Pali and English into Czech. And I'm curious if that process either reading the text originally in Pali and or the process of converting that into your native language, how that influenced your metabolizing the concepts that were being gone over?
Yes, that's a good topic. I mean, I should also mention, I forgot to say before, one big influence on me, of course, was like meeting Ajahn Sumedho, because I started going to Amaravati Monastery, and then we invited him to teach in Prague one year, 2016, and no, sorry, 96. And I remember discussing this topic with him, like how much do you need to study, how much do you need to learn. I was really into learning suttas, learning Pali, perhaps, really getting into that, and discussing this sort of university academic approach with him. And he sort of turned to me and said, how much longer do you want to study for? And I said, well, maybe another couple of years, just so that I can pass the exams and get my degree, and then after that I would be ready to become a monk, maybe. And he just turned to me and said, well, don't you think it's a waste of time? Maybe you can come and ordain at Amaravati straight away if you wish. So that also meant something to me, because I had been feeling like that already, and just to have it sort of confirmed from him was was nice, because he had done quite a bit of study himself, and he studied also when he was a young man, and he could see how far it could take him. But anyway, coming to study another language, that is really interesting, because I learned other languages before. I started early on learning second language and a third language and so on. So I had some experience with that, and how useful it is to know more than one language. It really enlarges sort of one's perspective on the world, and one understands, say, that words and designations of things, of objects, are not, they are not sort of fixed and unique. You can name a particular thing, give it a number of different names depending on which language you're using, and in one language it's maybe not really possible to name something as well as in a different language. So it's something really useful. So for me, the really delving into the whole Pali language, which is a dead language. It's not something that you can actually speak with anybody sort of live. It involved a lot of just working with translations. What I did was I took the available translations that I could get hold of, say, of a particular sutta passage. There was one in English and there was one in German. I could have both, or maybe two alternative English translations, and then I would compare them myself, and then slowly try to learn the grammar from a textbook I got. Just enough grammar that was necessary to understand that particular passage, so that I could translate it. And I had the A.K. Warder's, a classic Pali textbook, but that was quite difficult to use that, because that approach of learning the whole grammatical structure, which is a classical linguistic sort of approach to learning another language, it was the same approach as, say, learning Latin or learning Greek, but that didn't work so well for me. So I was lucky to find another book by Johansson, who was a Swedish psychologist that went to Sri Lanka, and he wrote this book, Pali for the Beginner. I think it's called Easy. Another different way of learning Pali, basically, which just teaches you enough of the grammar to understand, say, a particular short passage from a sutta, and explains just enough so you understand each word in the sentence. And then there's the translation. So you make the translation, and gradually, little by little, you get a feel for the language, the way the language works, just by translating in this way short passages taken from suttas, some of the gathas, the verses, and that was definitely more my approach. So I didn't really have to learn all the quite complex tables and whatnot, grammatical structures in Pali, but rather I started reading more and more just the suttas and translating them. I translated some shorter passages, like a whole chapter of the Samyutta Nikaya, and then different number of suttas from the Majjhima Nikaya and other individual suttas that were then later published as books, and just working with the dictionary a lot and really getting a feel for the language. I was able to just read the suttas in Pali after some amount of time, and of course you won't understand every single word, but you'll be able to follow like the whole flow of the sentence, and there's all these repetitions in Pali that you can follow, and you understand how it works, how the language works. And actually Pali is being an Indo-European language. It was not that different from the other languages like Czech and German that I've learned before, because it's an inflected language and the words change. There's certain principles that were actually not that hard for me to grasp. So yeah, gradually I really got into that whole, I would call it like the thought world of Pali Buddhism. So there's a whole, you start to use, I thought of it, I imagined it almost like you're kind of like swimming in this sea of Buddhism. So your whole thought world is like imbued with all these Buddhist ideas. And gradually, because I approached it and embraced it from such quite an early age, I was able to just, think in a way that you'll be using these sort of Buddhist concepts and ideas in your own thinking. So I didn't, then later when I came to the monastery, came to live as a monk, I already came from that kind of background, so it wasn't really difficult for me to adjust on that level. Whereas that's what might be the problem for other people, if they haven't internalized that whole kind of thought world of the Buddhist teachings. There's a lot of maybe misunderstandings that are possible, or just their own old ways of thinking, habitual ways of thinking that were picked up from the society, their education, all sorts of other cultural influences. It might not fit with the Buddhist teaching so well. So there might be a lot of this kind of dissonance. But in my case, it wasn't really the problem.